December 6, 1907. Monongah, West Virginia. At 10:20 in the morning, the mountain roared like thunder. A blast tore through the earth with the force of 1,000 storms. Within seconds, the number 6 and number 8 coal mines collapsed inward, sealing hundreds of men inside. Above ground, the air turned black, windows shattered. The ground heaved. Entire families ran toward the mines, screaming the names of fathers and sons who would never answer again. 362 men gone in less than a minute. So how could something like this happen? In the years before that morning, Monongah was a town that lived and breathed coal. It sat in a narrow valley, pressed between two ridges that never seemed to see the sun for long. Smoke rose from the chimneys before dawn, and by breakfast the sound of the whistle had already filled the air. That whistle meant one thing: another shift underground. Nearly every family had someone who worked the mines. Fathers, brothers, sons, even boys barely old enough to shave, all disappearing into the mountain's dark mouth each morning. They worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, for little more than $1. But it was honest work, the kind a man could build a life on, if he survived it. Monongah wasn't much to look at, just rows of clapboard houses, a church, a company store, and the river that carried the coal away. Yet the people who lived there called it home. They believed in hard work, in community, in the promise that coal would keep food on their tables, and for a while it did. But beneath the surface of that quiet little town, deeper than anyone could see, something dangerous was building. Before December 6, 1907, Monongah was a place of rhythm, not prosperity, not comfort, but rhythm. The kind that came from repetition. The whistle at dawn, the shuffle of boots on frozen dirt, the rattle of coal cars echoing through the hills. It was life measured not in minutes, but in shifts. The mines had been running non-stop since the turn of the century. Owned by the Fairmont Coal Company, the number 6 and number 8 mines were some of the most productive in the region. They fed the nation's hunger for energy, powering factories, trains and homes hundreds of miles away. The men who worked there came from everywhere: Italians, Hungarians, Poles, Russians, and a few Americans born and raised in the Appalachians. It was a Tower of Babel beneath the earth. In town, you could walk a single block and hear 5 different languages shouted over the sound of children playing and coal carts squealing past. For many immigrants, Monongah was supposed to be a beginning, the first foothold in a country that promised freedom and opportunity. They'd arrived at Ellis Island with calloused hands and hopeful hearts. But by the time they reached West Virginia, most of them had learned the truth. Opportunity here came with a price tag, and the price was paid in sweat and danger. Still, they worked. Because in a world that didn't welcome them easily, the mines didn't ask for English. They only asked for endurance. Each morning men gathered at the mouth of the mine with lunch pails and carbide lamps. They wore thick coats in winter, carried cigarettes behind their ears, and traded the same dry jokes they'd told 100 times before. A few crossed themselves before stepping inside. Others muttered quiet prayers. Down below, it was a different world. The air was thick with coal dust and the steady hum of machinery. The glow from a dozen lamps barely pierced the darkness. The deeper you went, the more the earth seemed to close in, pressing down from every side. The men worked by instinct, their lungs coated in dust, their hands raw and cracked from the cold. Yet there was a strange kind of pride in it, a brotherhood that only comes from danger shared. One miner later said, "You learned to tell who was near just by the rhythm of their pickaxe." It was like music in its own way. Above ground, life went on in patterns. The women of Monongah spent their mornings hanging laundry on lines stretched across narrow yards, their aprons powdered white with flour or coal soot, often both. They looked up each time the whistle blew, counting the hours until it called again, signalling the end of a shift. Children played barefoot in the mud streets, collecting bits of coal to sell back to the company for pennies. They knew their fathers by the sound of their boots on the front steps, by the smell of smoke and sweat that entered with them each night. At the heart of the town stood St. Stanislaus Church, its steeple visible from almost anywhere in Monongah. On Sundays the pews were full, Italian, Polish and American families packed together, each finding comfort in the same hymns sung in broken English and accented Latin. The priest, Father Everett, spoke in 3 languages just to be understood by all. He often said, "This mountain gives life to Monongah, and one day it will take it back." Most thought he meant it metaphorically. Among the miners was Antonio Tony Renzi, a young Italian who'd arrived only 2 years earlier. He was 24, newly married, with a son not yet old enough to walk. Tony worked the number 8 shaft, one of the deepest tunnels in the entire operation. He'd once been a stonemason back in Calabria, but coal paid better. Or at least it did until the company raised the rent on company housing and cut wages the same month. Still, Tony believed in the promise of America. At least here, he told his wife, a man can work and be left alone. But the truth was, they were never really left alone. The company store decided what things cost. The company doctor decided when you were fit to return to work. Even the church bell that marked Sunday Mass had been donated by Fairmont Coal. The men joked that the company owned everything in town, except their souls. There was also John McBride, a foreman and one of the few native-born Americans on the crew. He'd been in the mines since he was 12. Now, at 38, he walked with a slight limp and smoked a pipe carved from coal itself, a gift from his crew after 20 years underground. John was the kind of man who could read a tunnel wall like a book. He knew the groan of timber under pressure, the hiss that meant gas was building, the subtle tremor that told him to get his men out now. He'd been warning the company for months that number 6's was unsafe. Too dry, he told them, too much dust and not enough ventilation. They nodded, took notes and did nothing. To the outside world, Monongah was just another dot on a map. But to the people who lived there it was everything, a fragile balance of faith, fatigue and hope. When payday came, men gathered at the company office, their faces blackened but their eyes bright. They cashed their checks, bought flour, tobacco, and maybe a small toy for the children. Saturday nights meant a visit to the local tavern, where beer was cheap and laughter easy. For a few hours they forgot the darkness waiting below. No one in Monongah imagined the mountain would turn on them, not yet. But the signs were there, whispers among the men about new cracks in the walls, the smell of gas stronger than usual, the growing heat deeper in the tunnels. A few of them planned to speak up after the holidays. They'd already lost 2 men that fall to minor cave-ins. Accidents, the company said. But coal towns didn't stop for mourning. They buried their dead, wiped their hands, and went back underground. That was life in Monongah, steady, predictable, until it wasn't. The week before the explosion, winter had settled heavy over Monongah. The hills were dusted in white, the river rimmed with ice. Inside the company office, the talk wasn't of Christmas or weather. It was about output. Coal demand was surging, and Fairmont Coal wanted records broken before the year's end. To meet the quotas, the foremen pushed for longer hours, more cars, faster loads. The men obliged, as they always did. Overtime meant a few extra coins, maybe enough for a new coat, a better meal, or a gift for the children. But the pace had consequences. The air deep in the mine was getting drier by the day. Coal dust clung to everything. The walls, the tracks, the men themselves. The wooden beams creaked under the strain of constant blasting. Ventilation fans coughed weakly, barely moving the heavy air, and everyone knew what that meant, the perfect mix for an explosion. In those days, safety was more an idea than a reality. There were no federal mining laws yet, no inspections, no uniform standards. Each company decided for itself how much risk was acceptable. Miners carried open flames on their helmets, tiny carbide lamps that hissed faintly as they burned. When the gas built up, those lamps could turn a single spark into an inferno. John McBride, the foreman, had complained about it more than once. He even shut down a section of the number 6 shaft a few weeks earlier, after his crew reported a stale smell, the telltale sign of methane seeping from the walls. But the superintendent overruled him. "We can't stop for every whiff of gas, John," he'd said. "You know that." John knew something else too. A mine could only warn you for so long before it stopped giving warnings altogether. Some of the men joked that the mountain had a voice. When the timbers popped and groaned, they said it was speaking. When the walls trembled, they said it was breathing. That week, the mountain was restless. A Hungarian miner named Istvan Varga later told his wife he'd heard sounds in the lower tunnels like distant thunder. The earth shifting in its sleep, he called it. Another man, a young Italian named Pietro Rossi, refused to go down the next morning after feeling warm air gusting from a new seam. "Feels wrong," he told his crew leader. "Too hot down there." They laughed him off, but by the end of the week even the laughter felt strained. On the morning of December the 5th, the night crew surfaced just after dawn. They were covered in soot and sweat, their eyes glassy from fatigue. One of them, A quiet man named Sam Coleman said he'd seen blue flames flickering in a distant chamber. The others shrugged it off. Sometimes gas burned off in small pockets. It was part of the job. Still, Sam couldn't shake the feeling. He mentioned it to McBride before heading home. McBride jotted a note in his ledger. Inspect Section 11 tomorrow. That inspection would never happen. Outside, life went on like nothing was wrong. The town was preparing for Christmas. In the boarding houses, women baked bread and strung garlands of pine. Children pressed their faces to the glass windows of the company store, staring at tin toys and peppermint sticks they hoped Santa might somehow afford. At the church, Father Everett was planning the annual midnight mass. He'd ordered candles from Pittsburgh, hundreds of them, to light the sanctuary. A bright Christmas, he told the congregation, to honour the light of the world. No one knew how dark it would soon become. That evening, as dusk fell over the valley, a heavy fog rolled in. From the ridges above town, the smoke from the mines looked like breath rising from the earth. The men of the morning shift went to bed early. They'd be up before sunrise. Tony Renzi kissed his wife goodnight and whispered something about building a small garden come spring. He wanted to grow tomatoes, real ones, like in Calabria. His wife smiled, though she'd heard the same dream every year since they'd married. In another house, John McBride sat by the fire, flipping through his logbook. He stopped on an entry dated October the 3rd. Blast in Section 4, 2 men killed, cause, dust ignition, fan still weak. He closed the book slowly. His wife asked if he was coming to bed. Soon, he said, but he just sat there, listening to the faint whistle of the wind through the cracks in the walls. At dawn, the whistle sounded again, long and low, echoing through the valley. It was Friday, December the 6th, 1907. The men rose from their beds, dressed in silence, and stepped into the cold morning air. Frost covered the ground. The sky was pale and clear. By 6 a.m., the first shift had gone down. By 7:30, the mine was in full operation. Hundreds of men spread across the tunnels, picks striking rhythmically, carts clattering along the rails. Down below, the smell of gas was stronger now. McBride noticed it as soon as he reached his post. He ordered one of his men to open the airways wider, to get more circulation through the lower sections. The fans rattled and sputtered, barely moving the heavy air. At 8 o'clock, a crew reported hearing a rumble from the far wall of Section 12, like a distant train. By 9 o'clock, the canaries were restless in their cages. Still, the work went on. Above ground, Monongah looked peaceful. Children walked to the little schoolhouse near the river. A few wives carried baskets to the general store. The town clock struck 10. Then, at 10:20 a.m., time stopped. Witnesses said it began with a single deafening roar. The ground lifted beneath their feet. Windows shattered in every house. A black column of smoke shot into the sky, carrying with it splinters of timber, stone, and human debris. The first explosion came from the number 6 shaft. A second, even stronger blast followed from number 8. The 2 tunnels connected deep underground, amplifying the destruction. A farmer working his field 2 miles away said it sounded like the end of the world. Another man in Fairmont claimed his horse bolted when the shockwave hit. In town, people ran toward the mines, not away. They screamed names into the smoke, desperate for answers. The tipple, the wooden structure used to load coal, was gone. The entrance to number 8 had caved in completely. Flames licked at the edge of the hillside. The air was thick with sulphur, so strong it made people choke and vomit. For a few stunned moments, no one spoke. Then the screams began. By the time the dust settled, the entire valley knew this wasn't a small accident. This was something else, something no one could comprehend yet. Word spread by telegraph, then by train. Within an hour, rescuers were arriving from neighbouring towns, carrying shovels, lanterns, and hope that would soon run out. But all of that, the rescue attempts, the grief, the aftermath, was still to come. For now, Monongah stood frozen in the smoke of its own making, a town suddenly silent except for the faint, terrible sound of the mountain settling back into itself. The first explosion hit at 10:20 a.m. No one in Monongah would ever forget that sound. It began as a low rumble, deep beneath the ground, the kind that made coffee cups tremble and window panes hum. Then came the blast. A shockwave ripped through the valley, flattening fences, shaking houses off their foundations, and sending a column of black smoke hundreds of feet into the air. For a moment, no one could process what had happened. The townspeople froze where they stood, women with laundry half pinned to the line, Children in the schoolyard, clerks at the company store. Everyone stopped. Everyone looked toward the mines. A second explosion followed seconds later, louder, sharper, angrier. This one came from the number 8 shaft, connected to number 6 by a series of tunnels. The two blasts merged underground, tearing through with timber, supports and igniting coal dust that had been building for months. The mountain itself seemed to lift and exhale, belching smoke, fire and debris into the sky. Then came the silence. It was the kind of silence that feels unnatural, thick, heavy, alive. And in that stillness, the first screams broke out. The mine's tipple, the tall wooden structure used to load coal into rail cars, had been blown apart. The mine entrance was gone, collapsed inward like a crumpled tin can. For the first few minutes, people didn't even know where to begin. Wives came running down from the hills, skirts flying, calling their husbands' names. Children followed close behind, their faces streaked with soot. The air was so choked with dust and smoke that no one could see more than a few yards ahead. At the company office, telephones rang off the hook. One clerk shouted that the number 6 line had gone down. There was no contact with any crew underground. Another tried to reach the ventilation station, but the wires were dead. The mine superintendent, James Paul, burst out of the building and ran toward the site. "Get the pumps!" he yelled. "Get every man we've got!" But few knew what they were running into. Within 15 minutes, word had spread through the entire valley. Men dropped what they were doing and ran toward the smoke. Farmers from the outskirts, shopkeepers, even off-shift miners, all racing to the pit head. One eyewitness later described it as an army of shadows, men covered in soot before they even reached the site. By 10:40 a.m., hundreds of people had gathered at the mouth of the number 8 shaft. The ground was still hot beneath their boots. Flames flickered from cracks in the earth. A smell of sulphur and gas hung thick in the air. McBride was among the first on scene. He'd been thrown to the ground by the second blast but survived with only minor burns. He could see immediately how bad it was. The main entrance blocked by fallen rock and twisted rails, the secondary shaft on fire, the air so toxic it stung the eyes. "Get the air moving," he shouted. "We need ventilation before we go in." But the fans had been destroyed. The power lines were severed. The rescuers would have to go in blind. By 11 a.m, the first rescue teams entered what was left of the number 8 portal. They tied handkerchiefs around their faces, soaked them in water, and carried lanterns low to the ground. Inside, the heat was suffocating. Coal dust still hung in the air like fog. Every sound, every creak, every echo made them flinch. A few dozen yards in, they found the first bodies. Men sprawled across the rails, their lamps still burning weakly. Some had been killed instantly by the blast. Others looked like they'd simply fallen asleep. A rescuer named Tom Bennett later said, "They were all facing the same way, like they'd tried to run for it. Some didn't make it 3 steps. Further in, they found evidence of the fire's path. Charred timbers, melted tools, and the unmistakable odour of gas. The deeper they went, the worse it got. Outside, chaos reigned. By noon, Monongah was filled with people. Families crowded around the mine entrance, desperate for news. Women clutched rosaries, murmuring prayers in English, Italian, and Hungarian. The priest, Father Everett, moved among them, offering comfort he barely believed in himself. The company had set up makeshift first aid tents near the river. Wagons stood ready to transport the injured, though there were few to transport. At 12:30, a telegraph operator in Fairmont wired Washington, D.C. Explosion in Monongah, hundreds trapped, immediate assistance requested. Within hours, help was on the way. Engineers, medical staff, reporters, but they were still miles out. For now, the people of Monongah had only themselves. Back inside the tunnels, the rescue crews pushed deeper. They carried stretchers and extra lamps, marking the path with chalk on the walls. At each branching corridor, they split off in pairs, shouting Saug names into the darkness. The first survivor was found around 1 p.m. He was a young Italian named Marco Conti, his clothes burned and face blackened with soot. He'd been thrown into a small side tunnel by the blast, the debris forming a natural pocket that saved his life. When they pulled him out, he gasped for air and whispered, "They're still in there. So many. Please go back." The rescuers did, again and again, but each trip grew harder. By 2 p.m, smoke filled the tunnels so thick they could barely breathe. The air grew hotter the deeper they went. Their lamps flickered, the flame dancing blue a sign of gas. One rescuer collapsed near the 300-foot mark. 2 others dragged him out, coughing and retching. He never regained consciousness. Still no one stopped. By late afternoon, the railroad had brought in equipment from Fairmont: fans, pumps, stretchers and oxygen masks. Volunteers set up lines to carry the dead to a temporary morgue in the schoolhouse. Reporters began to arrive too, scribbling notes, snapping photos, asking questions that no one had the strength to answer. One headline the next day would read, "The Hill That Ate Its Men." At 4 p.m, a new explosion shook the ground, smaller, but enough to send a shower of rocks cascading down one of the entry shafts. The rescuers were forced to pull back. The fire underground had reignited. The oxygen they'd pumped in to save the miners was now feeding the flames. McBride ordered everyone out. "Seal it," he said quietly. "There's nothing left to save." As darkness fell, the full scale of the tragedy began to sink in. The roll book showed 367 men on shift that morning. Only a handful had been accounted for. Fathers, sons, brothers. Entire families wiped out in an instant. In one case, a single household lost a father and 5 sons. In another, 3 generations, grandfather, son and grandson, all perished together. By 7 p.m, the fires underground still burned. Smoke poured from fissures in the hillside, glowing orange in the night. The townspeople lit candles and stood in clusters near the mine, waiting for word that never came. A few men, stubborn or broken by grief, refused to stop digging. They clawed at the rubble with bare hands until others pulled them away. One man screamed his son's name until his voice gave out. Another simply sat in the dirt, staring into the smoke, whispering, "He'll find a way. He always finds a way." Midnight came and went. The rescuers worked by the lantern light now, their shadows stretching long across the ruins. They pulled out more bodies, blackened, broken, unrecognizable. They laid them side by side in the cold, covering each one with a sheet. At 2 a.m, the company sent telegrams to nearby towns asking for coffins. By dawn, trains were arriving full of them. Monongah had become a city of grief. When the sun rose on December 7th, the smoke still drifted over the valley. The rescuers made one final push into the main shaft. This time they carried gas indicators and breathing apparatus borrowed from Pittsburgh. They found entire crews huddled together, men who had tried to barricade themselves from the fumes. Some had written messages in chalk on the walls, names, prayers, farewells. One scrawl later found near a collapsed timber beam read simply, "Tell my wife I was thinking of her." By that evening, the official death toll had reached 362. 5 men remained unaccounted for, presumed buried beyond recovery. The company declared the rescue operation over. The tunnels were sealed with concrete to prevent further collapse. But for the people of Monongah, it wasn't over. It would never be over. The next morning, the church bell tolled 362 times. It took nearly half an hour. Father Everett delivered the sermon through tears. He told the congregation, "The mountain has spoken, and it will echo in this valley forever." Families packed the pews, clutching photographs, wedding rings, anything that remained. Outside, the town square filled with coffins, too many to count. A reporter from the Baltimore Sun described the scene. It was as if the town itself had died. Every street was lined with black cloth. Every window held a candle. The air was still, save for the sound of weeping. In the days that followed, the questions began. What caused the explosion? Why hadn't the company improved ventilation? Why had warnings been ignored? Fairmont Coal issued a statement calling it an unavoidable accident. They blamed natural gas seepage and unknown factors. Privately, investigators knew better. The buildup of methane, the coal dust coating the walls, the open flames of the miners' lamps. Every danger had been known and ignored. It wasn't fate, it was negligence. But the miners couldn't speak for themselves anymore. So the widows spoke for them. They wrote letters to newspapers, to politicians, to anyone who would listen. One widow, Maria Renzi, whose husband Tony and infant son had both died that day, wrote, "They told us the mountain was safe. They told us not to worry. Now the mountain is full of our men. Who will tell the truth for them?" It would take more than 60 years for that truth to become law, when federal mine safety regulations were finally enacted. And it began here, in a small town that no longer made the front pages. By Christmas, Monongah was quiet. The snow returned, blanketing the ruins in white. Children placed flowers by the sealed mine entrance. A wooden cross stood where the tipple had once been. One rescuer carved a message into its base. They gave their lives to light our homes. Morning came slowly to Monongah on December 8th, 1907. The smoke had thinned, but it still clung to the valley like grief itself. The fires were out now, replaced by the grey haze of winter and ash. What had once been a living mountain now looked like a wound, black and hollow, bleeding silence into the sky. The townspeople moved through the streets as if underwater, dazed, their faces blank from sleeplessness and shock. Everywhere you looked, there were signs of loss: a boot without its pair, a lunch pail still half full, a lamp, its flame long gone cold. Near the river, men built wooden tables to serve as makeshift morgue platforms. The bodies that were found were brought here, one by one, wrapped in canvas or laid out beneath blankets. The rescuers worked in shifts, trying to match names to faces, an almost impossible task. Many were burned beyond recognition. Others had been trapped so deep that only scraps of clothing or the small worn tokens they carried, a watch, a ring, a crucifix, could identify them. At the schoolhouse, where children once recited lessons, the chalkboards now held lists of names, those confirmed dead, those still missing, and those whose fates were unknown. The sound of women crying filled the air, soft at first, then louder as the reality began to sink in. By the third day, trains arrived from Fairmont, Morgantown, and Pittsburgh carrying coffins. Hundreds of them, stacked like cargo, plain and unvarnished. There weren't enough hearses to carry them all. The company used its coal wagons instead. The funerals began almost immediately. At St. Stanislaus Church, Father Everett performed masses from dawn until well after midnight. His voice breaking more with each one. He stopped counting after 70. The churchyard filled with crosses, many bearing only a single word: unknown. When the bell tolled, it echoed through the valley, rolling over the hills like thunder. It rang 362 times, once for every soul lost. The rest of the country was stunned. Within days, the New York Times ran the headline: "Explosion kills 361 men in Monongah mine. Worst disaster in U.S. history." Reporters flooded into the small town, their boots sinking into the mud and snow as they searched for survivors to interview. They found only widows. Most of them couldn't speak English, so translators were brought in. The women described their husbands, how long they'd worked, how they'd left that morning, what they'd said at breakfast. One Italian woman said simply, "He kissed the baby and said, 'I'll be back for dinner.'" He wasn't. President Theodore Roosevelt sent a telegram expressing profound sympathy. But sympathy couldn't feed the children or rebuild the homes that now stood empty. The company promised compensation, $150 per family, enough to cover a funeral, but little else. Many of the widows couldn't even claim it. Their husbands' names had never been recorded properly, written down in ledgers with missing letters or mistaken spellings. Some bodies were buried without identification, their names lost in translation: Italian, Polish, Hungarian, all rendered phonetically by clerks who couldn't pronounce them. By Christmas, the Red Cross had arrived with blankets, food, and a few kind words. But most of Monongah's families were already preparing to leave. There was no work left, no money, no reason to stay. The company rebuilt the mine within months. They had to. Coal was still in demand, and in 1907 business didn't pause for mourning. By spring, new men were working the same tunnels that had buried the old. A few locals returned, out of desperation more than courage. Others swore they'd never go underground again. The company installed new ventilation fans and updated the safety notices, claiming the tragedy had taught valuable lessons. But there was no law requiring them to do more. No federal inspectors, no enforcement, no real accountability. A few newspapers tried to keep the story alive. The Pittsburgh Gazette wrote, "If 300 men were lost in battle, they'd be called heroes. When they die in a mine, they're just casualties of progress." But soon even the headlines faded. America moved on. For the people of Monongah, forgetting was impossible. The town became quieter with each passing year. The laughter of children gave way to the sound of trains carrying coal dug by strangers. The houses of the dead stood empty, their porches sagging, windows broken. Every December, the few who remained gathered at the church to light candles and read the names of those lost. The list was long but familiar. Each name carried a story of a father, a son, a friend. Some said they could still hear the whistle echo through the valley on cold mornings. That same whistle that had once meant another day of work, another chance to come home alive. The first ripples of change. Though the company avoided blame, the explosion forced a reckoning far beyond Monongah. In Washington, lawmakers could no longer ignore the growing list of mining disasters. Just that same year, over 3,200 miners had died in accidents across the United States. The Monongah disaster became the breaking point. 2 years later, in 1909, Congress created the U.S. Bureau of Mines, the first federal agency tasked with investigating mining conditions and promoting safety. It had no power to regulate yet, but it could study, document, and expose. Inspectors visited sites across Appalachia, measuring gas levels, testing ventilation, and publishing reports that made it impossible for the public to remain ignorant. Slowly the tide began to turn. By the 1910s, safer lighting systems replaced open-flame lamps. By the 1920s, new training standards emerged, and by the 1940s, Congress finally passed comprehensive mine safety laws. But for the widows and children of Monongah, these reforms came too late. Their loved ones had already paid the price that bought those laws. The children left behind. More than 250 women were widowed that day. Over 1,000 children lost a father. In the months after the explosion, a wave of orphans spread across Marion County. Some were taken in by relatives. Others were sent to church-run homes in Pennsylvania or Ohio. A few older boys lied about their ages to work in other mines. They became the next generation of miners, children digging to support families broken by mining itself. One of them, Frank Renzi, was only 9 when his father Tony died in the No. 8 shaft. He left school 2 years later and took a job at another mine near Clarksburg. When asked why, he said, "The mine killed my father, but it's the only thing that'll feed us." That story repeated itself across Appalachia. Work was scarce, and for the immigrant families, the mines were the only door that stayed open, even when everyone knew what waited behind it. The quiet years. For decades, Monongah faded into the background of American memory. There were no national memorials, no textbooks, no monuments beyond a few local crosses. When survivors grew old and died, their stories went with them. The mine eventually shut down in the mid-20th century. Grass grew over the entrances. Children played on the slopes where the explosions had once thundered. In time, even the company changed names and ownership, as if trying to shed the weight of its own history. But the valley remembered. On winter mornings, fog still pooled low and heavy, and the old-timers swore it carried the voices of the men who never came home. Rediscovery. It wasn't until the Centennial year, 2007, that Monongah's story returned to the national stage. By then, most of the original families had scattered across America, their grandchildren barely aware of the connection. A group of historians and descendants launched an effort to locate every victim's name and origin. They found records in old ledgers, shipping manifests, and church archives, many of them written in broken Italian or Hungarian. They discovered something the newspapers of 1907 hadn't cared to mention. Of the 362 men killed, more than half were immigrants, and dozens more were likely unrecorded, brought in off the books by labour brokers. The true death toll may have been closer to 500. When those numbers were published, the world finally took notice again. The President of Italy sent representatives to Monongah. A memorial bell was cast in Agnone, Italy, and shipped across the Atlantic. It was rung for the first time on December 6, 2007, 100 years to the day after the explosion. The sound carried across the valley deep and mournful, as if the mountain itself was answering back. What it meant. The Monongah disaster wasn't just a mining tragedy, it was a mirror. It reflected the cost of industrial America, the lives traded quietly for progress. Every light bulb, every train, every steel beam that built the 20th century, all of it ran on the backs of men like those who died in Monongah. In the years since, safety has improved, technology has advanced, and oversight has grown, yet every miner who descends underground still carries a piece of that history with him. The lessons of Monongah are written not only in law, but in blood. The living memory. Today the town is small again, barely 1,000 people. The mines are sealed, the equipment long gone, but the ghosts remain. Visitors who come to the memorial often describe an eerie quiet. No birdsong, no wind, just the steady hum of the river below. A plaque near the site reads, "They entered the mountain as men. They emerged as legend. Each year, descendants gather on December 6th to place flowers and light candles. Some bring old photos, some bring coal, polished smooth." And for a few moments the valley feels alive again, filled with the whispers of fathers and sons, speaking in every language that once echoed here. The long shadow. In the century that followed Monongah, the same pattern repeated itself. Explosions in West Virginia, Kentucky, and in Pennsylvania, each one called the worst since Monongah. Each one a grim reminder that the lessons learned in 1907 could still be forgotten. But Monongah remains the first, the one that woke America up. The Bureau of Mines that grew from it would evolve into today's Mine Safety and Health Administration, MSHA. Modern ventilation systems, gas detectors, and emergency protocols all trace their roots to that cold December morning. Every safety lamp, every hard hat, every rescue drill, all of it carries the echo of the men who didn't have those things. And yet, beyond policy and engineering, Monongah left something more profound, a reminder of human resilience. In a time when immigrants were treated as expendable, this tragedy forced the nation to see them as people, not just labour. The faces in those newspaper photos, tired, dirty, anonymous, became symbols of sacrifice. The widows who couldn't read English became activists by necessity. The children who worked to survive became the generation that demanded better. Monongah taught America that progress without humanity is nothing more than destruction dressed in steel. Returning to the valley. If you visit Monongah today, you'll find a small park near the river. A stone monument lists the names of the known dead, 362 carved into granite, some duplicated, some incomplete. Beside it stands the bell from Italy, its bronze face weathered by Appalachian rain. Each December the people ring it once for every man lost. The sound rolls through the valley deep and steady, crossing the same hills that once carried coal trains away. Locals say when the final tone fades, you can hear the echo of another, faint, distant, rising from beneath the ground. Maybe it's just the wind through the hollow, or maybe, as Father Everett once said, the mountain is still speaking. Reflection. Standing there now, it's hard to imagine what it must have been like that day. The whistle blowing, the earth shaking, the smoke rising where men had gone only hours before. It's harder still to imagine the courage it took to go back down, to try to save the very men who had been lost. Monongah was not a story of victims alone. It was a story of fathers who worked until their lungs gave out, mothers who endured, children who carried on. It was a story of the price America paid to build itself, one coal car at a time, and when the whistle finally fell silent, it left behind more than sorrow. It left a legacy, one carved into law, memory, and the quiet hills of West Virginia, where even now, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the mountain breathe.